together is we have our voting rights program, which really helps to protect the rights of all Nebraskans. And then, while we're protecting those rights, we have our youth civic leadership, which is training that next generation of young civic leaders. And then our civic health initiative, which really works in communities, helping them to find out what they like and don't like, and how they can be making improvements and bettering their communities. And team voting rights, John, I think he hopped back on, so he might be ready to introduce himself. But then it's me. We have our GOTV director, Heather Ingdahl, and then we have Margaret Marsh, who is the most amazing person I've ever met. And then we have Mike Forsyth, who is my arch nemesis. So that's our team. John, were you ready to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I think my mic's working. Do you hear me? You do? Okay, great. Yeah, I'm John Cartier, Director of Voting Rights, and it's great to see everyone join us for a little conversation about the Constitutional Convention. But you're doing so well, Brad. You just go ahead and keep it up.
No, you're definitely going to be talking about it. I feel like it's a very lawyery thing, so I'll need my lawyer on the phone. But first, I do like to talk about just a little bit where our voting rights come from. So on a federal level, it comes from the 15th Amendment, which gave African-American men the right to vote, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, the 24th Amendment, which got rid of poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. And then also with those federal protections for voting rights, there's some legislation that's been really, really helpful, including the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Americans with Disability Act, and the Help America Vote Act. So all those kind of policies come together to give us the voting rights we have right now. And that piece is going to be really important for what we're going to be discussing today, which is the Constitutional Convention, because those four protections for voting rights that I just mentioned that are constitutional amendments would be at risk with a constitutional convention, because in a constitutional convention, people would be changing and making edits to our Constitution. So those are four pretty huge rights that come from the Constitution that enable us to vote that would be at risk. John, do you have anything to add on this piece?
Yeah, I think you explained it really well, Brad. The main concern where we stand from Civic Nebraska's side in protecting voter rights is that a lot of the protections come from the federal government in terms of what states are able to do to restrict, and in some cases even completely prohibit people from casting a ballot, which would be counted. So it's really important then when we're talking about Constitutional Convention as a topic, that we keep that in mind as we talk with either our friends or family, or in this instance, state senators who right now don't really necessarily see the Constitutional Convention as something necessarily that's even going to happen, or it's really just so far off in the distance they're willing to trade a vote or make a compromise in order to get something else in return. But we don't want to take any chances on this, and there's a lot of national interests for proponents and opponents of Constitutional Convention. And we'll go into later here, but the proponents, what they want to do through Constitutional Convention, I mean, it would completely change the way of life as we know it, and that's not even exaggeration.
Yep. So the other protection I always mention is the line in our state constitution, which plays a little bit less of a role right now with this policy, because we do have that line in our state constitution: all elections shall be free, and there shall be no hindrance or impediment to the right of the qualified voter to exercise the elective franchise. But a lot of what makes up who is a qualified voter comes from our U.S. Constitution, which the Constitutional Convention could totally change. So there's a little bit of information here that I'll talk to everyone about. But first, I just want to have John kind of explain some more on the overall topic of a constitutional convention, how it works, how it could work. Has this ever happened before? So John, if you want to kind of just go over that so everyone can know.
Yeah, sure. So under Article 5 of the US Constitution, there's two ways that we're able to make amendments to the Constitution. The first way that people typically know is Congress will pass a measure that would be an amendment. So the prior examples of those voting rights protections are one example of amendments that have been passed. And those will then go to ratification to the state houses and state legislatures, and even in one instance, something called state conventions, which was for the repeal of alcohol prohibition, I believe. And so that's the way we're all really familiar with making amendments. There's a second way that the founders included when our Constitution was first adopted, and that is kind of a reversal. The states would pass through, oh my goodness, I'm spacing, I think it's 3/5 of majority for the states who want to call a convention themselves for the purpose of making amendments to the Constitution. And a historical example of something like this is in 1776 when our delegates from the various colonies and slash states by that time got together and they wanted to make amends to the U.S. Articles of Confederation at that point. And the only way that they could make amendments under the articles was unanimous vote. And I think you can imagine anything unanimous is almost impossible, especially when you're trying to make a major change to like a country's foundation through a document. So through that original convention that was called by the states at that point, what they really did was completely disregarded what the Articles of Confederation said for even making amendments to that own document. They sort of relied on the people's inherent ability to cast off any form of government that isn't serving their purposes. So there's a really interesting precedent when we look all the way back to how the United States basically turned into a second country right after this U.S. Revolution, and that was through adopting the Constitution. And that's the closest parallel we can really take a look at. Throughout the years, there have been state constitutions that have called conventions for their own, making amendments to their state constitutions. So that's something that has happened. But in this instance, when it's at a federal level, it's a little bit more concerning because once these delegates or representatives from the states are called together in order to put forward a convention that would make amendments to the US Constitution, there's not a lot of guide rails or really much things we can even take a look at and say, no, you can't do that, or this is what your purpose is. It really just becomes up to them at that point to potentially making completely radical changes to our foundational documents without much consent from the people. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, and I'd be happy to go over any questions, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, and I think always the biggest thing that scares me about it, because uh, there have been recently really two pushes for a constitutional convention. You've seen it being pushed to have a balanced budget, and like the idea behind it, like we're just going to make sure everything has a balanced budget. And we've also seen it being pushed as a way to get rid of like Citizens United and money in politics. And like getting rid of money in politics is something I am 1000% behind. But what's scary is that it does like kind of open the entire Constitution up for edits. And when I think about that, I think about like who will be in the room writing that, who will be those delegates. John, are there like specific rules on who would become a delegate, or like who would Nebraska be sending, and how would that work?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate in this topic. Who might the delegates be, how they're selected, really who gets to determine who's a representative for the state. And when we look at the text of Article 5, it says that Congress shall call a convention once the states get enough votes, basically petitioning them to have a convention to make amendments. And that line that says Congress calls, a lot of constitutional scholars believe that it would be Congress who sets the rules as far as what delegates would look like coming from the different states. Now, if you ask proponents about this on the Constitutional Convention side, they maintain that states have the authority to send as many delegates as they want, or who they really choose, but they don't really have much as far as a textual argument why that is the case. What I think would happen, the most likely case, if this idea got really close to the finish line in terms of getting enough states to ratify, which for the balanced budget amendment, they're pretty close. Last time I checked, it was maybe like 6 or 7 states away. So if for whatever reason they got enough states to call a convention, Congress would pass a bill that would set the rules, allocate money, have a location, what the procedures would be, because that would just be the most natural extension of their federal powers to make amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And that one couple lines or couple words in the Article 5 where it says Congress shall call is pretty conclusive in my mind that delegates, the different procedural rules and all that stuff would come from a bill passed by Congress, laying the foundations for what it would look like. And that would pretty much nullify everything that states have done since then to pass things like faithful delegate laws, which is another topic here, and other things like that.
Cool. Yeah, because that's another thing I always think about is there is kind of that idea that we as states can say, like, we're calling a constitutional convention for a balanced budget or to get rid of Citizens United, but there's nothing that makes that set, like those are the only things that we can like talk about or change once we've had this convention. And even when you think about if like there was to be one and it was called for a balanced budget, everything in the government is affected by its ability to have a budget or not have a budget. So when you're making those constitutional amendments, like when you're thinking about voting rights and how it could affect it, like saying that the Department of Justice is like too expensive to have affects the budget. John, I know in the past, if you want to go into it, they've done like trial constitutional conventions. Supporters have, and like some of the policies that end up coming out of there, even when it's called for a balanced budget, are pretty drastic and pretty extreme. Like in one of them, didn't they get rid of the IRS or something, which I feel like would make it hard to have a balanced budget? But you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the Convention of States organization, which is the main driver behind the Constitutional Convention, several years ago, they called a mock convention together, and they asked mostly elected officials from other states to come and basically go through the procedure just as an example and kind of a thought experiment. And a lot of the things that they ended up passing as far as like proposed amendments was things that got rid of Department of Education. It got rid of the direct election of U.S. senators. A lot of other portions of the federal government were also on the chopping block. It was a really good indicator of what, in the wrong hands anyways, from our perspective, what could happen in terms of a convention moving forward. So yeah, it's definitely something to raise an eyebrow about. And we produced a really interesting video that quoted Mark Meckler, which is kind of the guy behind the Convention of States group itself, what he was bragging about that they were able to get done through a convention. And we can put that link in the comment box here. And it's really short, but in his own words, I mean, he says it right there. It's not the greatest idea.
Cool. Well, I'll open it up for questions. I know Mike has some stuff he wanted to talk about for a little while, so.
Well, I wanted to share that one of our Hastings League members, Elaine Landwehr, has been researching this for over a year did a great presentation for League, and our wonderful local news person put it on the front page of the Tribune. And it was, he did a great job of summarizing what she had said. And within a couple days, if I remember right, there was a 3-page column from our Senator Halloran, who's the one who's putting it forth in the unicameral, trying to debunk things that Elaine had said. He couldn't because she's factual, but he's really hot to trot with it.
Yeah, he brought this bill this year, LR. Hold on, John, what's my number again for this bill?
Let's see.
I always blank on the numbers off the top of my head.
LR 14.
Oh yeah, LR 14. Yep.
LR 14.
He brought this bill, and this is one of those bills where I always think, like, if I could guarantee that I would be the only delegate to a constitutional convention and be making these decisions, I would be 100% in support of it. And I think a lot of supporters, when they've done events at the legislature and things like that, like, a lot of them are convinced like they're going to be the actual delegate from Nebraska who's getting to help essentially create a new constitution. But the reality is, like, who would be being the delegates, there's not really any set rules. So it could just as easily end up being something where everyone who's a delegate has interest in making sure people have less of a voice rather than more of a voice. And, all those different amendments I showed you for the Constitution that our voting rights, a lot of our voting rights really come from. I mean, those would be open to edits just as much as anything else in the Constitution. So that's just something this idea is always the thing I find the scariest out of all the policies we deal with, just because it is literally changing our founding document, which, hey, I definitely think it needs some changes, but there is another process that gave us some of those great amendments that have expanded the right to vote, and the process doesn't put everything else we have at risk. And so that's why I think is really the danger of the Constitutional Convention. It's not just an amendment for something on a specific thing, but it puts everything at risk. So to me, I have yet to hear like a policy idea that I love so much that I'm willing to, risk my right to vote and the right to vote of everyone I care about just for that policy.
We do have a question in the chat. What states have already signed on for a constitutional convention?
Yeah, really good question. So the estimates for the balance of budget amendment has it at 28 states, and they need 2/3, so 34 of the various state legislatures to sign on. So it's pretty close for the balance of budget. And on that topic, there is some debate that other states have passed other basically calls for a convention for other reasons, which everything from like polygamy to direct election senators, all kinds of stuff. And some say that you can aggregate those calls for a convention alongside with the balanced budget and just call like a general convention, which seems to be getting a lot of traction in terms of the Constitutional Convention supporters. But how they're going to convince Congress to agree with that if they don't really want a convention to move forward, I have no idea how that would work. But as far as the balanced budget is pretty close, and it's one of the things that they still push pretty hard in the different states. And there's been some states that have rescinded prior calls. We've introduced legislation that would have us rescind our call for a balanced budget convention, and it hasn't gone anywhere. But if this wasn't done in other states throughout the last couple of decades, then they would have already gotten to 34, and we would have got to see what a convention have looked like. But to answer that question, it's about 28 out of 34.
And isn't there like even just a debate over whether like after we do it, like we can change our mind, like whether rescinding them even counts?
Yeah, and there's some people don't think that is appropriate or constitutional, but they're not very persuasive on the national front.
I wanted to ask if I could about funding. When I looked it up, I see the Koch brothers, before whichever one died, were throwing a lot of money at it. Who else is throwing money at it? And does that give us a clue of what they're really trying to do? I've got friends on Facebook in very red areas that this is a very hot topic, but when you look at their videos and things like that, you really can't tell what they want to accomplish other than calling a convention. And it seems like that's intentional. So I just wondered what the dark money is telling us could be the motives.
Yeah, I think the motives would be like kind of what you're like on both sides. Like it's really a chance to rewrite the Constitution in the way you want. So you have like people who like the Koch brothers who want to totally rewrite it, and you also have people who want to rewrite it to get rid of money in politics. The danger is more just like that it can be opened up and there would be that rewrite. But I think the idea itself, like I said, if I thought I could be the only delegate and be making all the decisions myself, it would be an idea that I'd be like, yes, let's do this. But there's the reality of that. But I think keeping it broad in general, what would happen with it is part of the strategy, because people do start thinking like, I'm going to be able to write the new Constitution and everything will be the way I want it. And some people want to do really good things with that, and some people want to do really terrible things with that. And it's about, yeah, it's like you just have to have that like realization that there's not going to be any type of guarantee, because if there could be that guarantee, I think I'd probably be open to it if somebody could guarantee me something about what it would look like, because with anything, you can do great things with a lot of power or terrible things with a lot of power, but this just has so much potential to do terrible things. And honestly, when I think about this, all I think about is like how many Black people would be in our room if a constitutional convention is called. Like the last time a constitutional convention happened, when it was first written, like there weren't any of us in the room, or at least we weren't getting to help write it. And I haven't seen like anything that would make me feel like the numbers would be much better if it happened again. And just that we have that other process to change the Constitution. So it's definitely something. It can be scary. I think it's intentionally kept pretty broad. Usually supporters of it in the legislature are some of the like most intense advocates you will ever meet. And they're also usually some of the most who are a little bit out there and think like they will really be like creating whatever they want. And like, the Constitution will just be the, like it'll just be the one amendment they like. So like, I really like this amendment. Everything else in the Constitution is gone. And like, I'll never pay taxes again or things like that. Like,
Yeah. And on that point, one of the other examples of state convention or constitutional conventions, there's been some good ones, but it was one of the primary drivers behind a lot of Jim Crow laws for the various states when they called conventions mainly for purpose of making felons unable to vote. And that was kind of a hot fix in order for them to bake into their state constitutions a bunch of other really bad things for voters. And I mean, that happened, a long time ago, but it is a good example of what could happen on a federal level in similar circumstances with just the wrong people. It's it's not I don't know, it's kind of a scary idea thinking about what that might look like at the end of the day. And when you're thinking about people who are already have a really low trust in government as it stands, what kind of pandemonium that would look like if suddenly everyone wakes up and the entire nation is changed in a pretty dramatic fashion. A lot of confusion.
Cool. Well, were there any other just questions we can answer about the convention? From who I've seen is on, it looks like a lot of everyone who's on has kind of helped out with our different advocacy work before. So you kind of know a little bit about what we need to be happening right now, which is calls to your state senators, especially on this bill, because like John said, it's something that it seems a little like it's got a while to happen. But like for really all we know, like, the next few states could come this year. So it has been something where we've seen movement, and we've been seeing like typically really strong supporters of voting rights and voting rights policy be willing to trade their votes in order to get something else they like passed, because it's like you need other states to also come along. But it's not something that we really feel comfortable with people risking and us potentially endangering our rights to vote. So it is a bill because there is that feeling like it's a little bit far off where, typical people who we could just like 1000% count on their support are a little shaky. So we really need calls to be happening, and there's not a single legislative district where we couldn't use some calls to the different senators. As far as the timeline for this bill, right now it is in committee still, but what we think will probably happen is not that it'll necessarily make it out of committee through the regular process, but that it would be pulled out of committee because it does have a priority bill designation right now. So John can go a little bit more into the pull process, but my understanding is it's where the majority of senators decide like, we're not going to take the advice of what this committee is saying to do, and it's just going to like skip the process and just be able to be scheduled like it passed out of the committee. So I think that would let kind of like the hearing and stuff, like we won't necessarily need that phase of the advocacy, but really more reaching out to senators, letting them know like why you're scared about this policy and why you think it's a bad idea. And really just letting your friends and neighbors know about it so they can do advocacy around it as well, because there is not like on most bills where we're like confident in any senator's vote, because a lot of people have kind of shown some willingness to give and trade a little on this one, because it does seem a little far from happening still, even though it's only, it's less than 10 states would have to go along with it.
Yeah, it's like Brad said, takes a majority of the floor of the unicameral will take something out of committee, and it's kind of frowned upon in a sense, but it's probably going to happen. It seems like Senator Halloran's been making a lot of deals, but that doesn't mean that some of these same senators will support it, through cloture vote or through the filibuster process. So if there are trading some votes for this just to get it out of the committee, that's when we really need to turn the intensity up and remind some of our allies who help that out that it's not something that they can continue to make compromises on, because all the reasons we've talked about today why it's not a good idea.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I was looking at the email that was sent out about this, and there are 7 senators that were listed specifically to write to. Is there any reason why those 7 in particular?
Brad, do you have an answer?
Yeah, so those 7 in particular at the time, just the main ones who we've just through our lobbyist Weston was just kind of saying like, hey, these are the votes where there is some risk, and we need to either try and convince them to come back and be with us again, or they've never been with us, or we're just not sure where they're at and we're not getting a clear answer. So it's really like those are ones where we're a little less sure than everyone else. But with this, just because of the vote trading and kind of like compromises we've been seeing happening around it, I don't think there's any senator that I wouldn't reach out to about this. Even in the past, like I've said, how there's been two different reasons people want to call a convention. We've had passed bills here in the state like that have called conventions for other reasons since I've been doing this in 2017, and we've seen like people like, you vote for mine, I'll vote for yours type thing. And there's not another one beyond LR 14 this year, but and I'm sure part of it is like, you're a state senator at the time, like you probably think you have a decent shot if there is a constitutional convention at being a delegate, but there is a little bit more just wiggle room in the way senators vote in terms of protecting people's voting rights with this policy. And it's just because I really do think people like see that window like, oh, I might be able to be a delegate, and this is how I like leave my footprint like on like the world and democracy.
Thanks. I was just wondering because my senator is listed on here and I've written to her multiple times. She's very difficult to get a response from. So I was just curious.
Yeah, some of them are like that. Some senators, they will avoid giving a reply or a stance just like at all costs. But that's the great thing about advocacy, is that like they're there to represent us. So we can just keep bugging them until we get a response, or they'll just keep hearing from us. That's my favorite thing, is like, it's not bad to just like get on people's nerves. Like, trust me when I say that on the opposite side of the Constitutional Convention, we've seen votes in the past. I've had senators tell me in the past, like, I'm only voting for this because these people call my office every day, and I'm voting for it just on this, like, on the first vote, just so that they can stop bothering me about it. But I won't vote for it, like, if it gets to the end or something like that. I've heard that on when we've had the Constitutional Convention come up before, because they are some of the just most active people around their beliefs and getting this through, which is why it's partially such a concerning thing, because I struggle thinking of another bill that we work on where the opposition and the people who want this bill to happen are just so intense, and I want to make sure we're able to match them. I like know for sure, and thank you to everybody who has joined this call, but I do know for sure if they did a call, they would have like 50-60 people on right now, and they would be like 50 and 60 of the people we would all probably least like to be rewriting our US Constitution. So it's something we really need as much strong advocacy that we can get around as possible.